Sim racers can be a fanatical bunch, whether it's arguing about which sim has the best tyre model, whether triple screens or VR is superior, or if it's some idiot ranting about people being too competitive in the wrong game mode. However, I think the topic of camera choice has a tendency to unite a lot of sim racers under a banner of hate directed at public enemy number one, the chase cam, denouncing it as a heretical affront to all that is good and holy in the virtual horsepower world. Personally, I'm a cockpit camera guy, but I wasn't when I first started. The original Dirt Rally was my introduction to sim racing, and because I was coming from arcade racing games, I was initially driving in chase cam, so I understand from first-hand experience that the puritanical attitude that some people have about it, especially when they don't clearly explain why they think the cockpit is better, can be really off-putting. I also know that making that transition to the cockpit camera can feel impossibly difficult in the beginning. I've also occasionally seen the misconception that the cockpit camera is simply a difficulty enhancer with no practical benefit. So I want to clear some of that up and give you cockpit virgins out there some helpful information. Keep in mind, I will be discussing this topic from a rally driving perspective, but much of what I'm talking about here will translate over to other sim racing disciplines as well. Years ago, when I initially tried out the cockpit camera, I remember having similar thoughts to Big Daddy from Django Unchained.
Damn, I can't see fucking shit out of this thing.
And there is some truth to this. For instance, when you're coming up on a crest or jump, the chase cam can allow you to see over it a little bit earlier, which can be especially helpful for the jumps because you can make last-minute adjustments to your trajectory before you yeet yourself off into the tree line. When you're used to having that extra visibility, it can feel pretty terrible to have it taken away from you. However, not everything is as it seems. Take this corner on one of Dirt Rally 2's Greek stages as an example. It's a fairly tight right-hander. This screenshot is taken, I would say, approaching the middle of the corner. We have a rock wall on the inside there which is obscuring the corner exit, so I can't really see my way out. However, let's switch from the chase cam to the cockpit, and as you can see, totally different story. Because my viewpoint is further up towards the front of the car, rather than being a few meters behind the rear bumper, it means I can see through the corner earlier, and that allows me to get back on the power sooner, because I don't have to wait as long for that visual information. You'll find this principle applies to a lot of corners, and after you've grown used to the cockpit camera and you try driving in chase cam again, you might find yourself wondering how the hell you used to see where you were going. The point is, I think the change to visibility is, at the absolute worst, a trade rather than a downgrade. If anything, I think the type of visibility that you're gaining with a cockpit cam is more conducive to driving fast than what the chase cam offers. And I personally found that losing the vertical visibility from the chase cam forced me to pay more attention to the pace notes, and that ultimately led me to driving more proactively, setting myself up for corners in advance rather than driving reactively when I arrived at them. Now, if you ask me, the real killer app for driving from the cockpit is that it's easier to control the car. You might be asking yourself, how the hell does the camera affect car control? Which is a very good question. It all boils down to visual stimulus. So let's take a look at a common car handling scenario. Let's say you're putting the power down on the way out of a corner, you begin to oversteer and the rear steps out. If we're ignoring force feedback and we're going purely off of visuals, the best way to tell if you're oversteering is to look at where the nose of the car is pointing. If you find the car suddenly pointing towards the inside of the corner, that's cut and dry oversteer. The thing is, it's way easier to see where your car is pointing from the cockpit camera. When you're driving, naturally you're going to be focusing your vision on the road ahead, at least 95% of the time. So, when you're viewing the road from the cockpit and the angle of your car changes, the road itself, the thing you're already looking at, is what moves on screen. Essentially, the world is rotating around your car, which is a very obvious visual cue for you to react to. By comparison, in chase cam, the road ahead doesn't move proportionally to your car's movement, because the car itself is also moving relative to the camera. The car is already a much smaller portion of your view to get feedback from, but it's also not where you're looking at in the first place. Your eyes have to travel back and forth between the road and the car, which is distracting. Whereas the cockpit camera gives you everything you need while only having to focus on the road. Ultimately, I think this is the key thing that makes driving from the chase cam feel so numb. You're decoupled and insulated from all of the little movements and bumps and angle changes that the car goes through. For instance, the body roll you see when turning left or right, or under acceleration and braking, is way more obvious in the cockpit. And hell, if you tip the car or flip it over, it's a whole other thing to behold from the cockpit.
Oh no, please! Oh goddamn! Oh, get me out this motherfucking death machine right now!
I do think it's worth acknowledging that not all chase cams are created equal, and you might find that some feel better to drive from than others. If we're focusing on the amount that the car moves relative to the camera, I would say that the Codemasters games have a moderate amount of movement. Richard Burns' Rally has significantly more, which makes it particularly undrivable, if you ask me. And on the other end of the spectrum, Assetto Corsa seems to have the chase cam totally locked to the car, which is better, but still looks and feels a bit weird in its own right to me. Still, I think as a general rule, you'll have a better driving feel in the cockpit. I'd say it's a similar feeling to playing at 60 FPS or a high refresh rate for the first time. It's just a better stream of visuals for you to react to. On that same note, you'll notice in most games that by default, the cockpit cam will have some level of shake and movement built into it. This is personal preference, but I like to turn it right down or off entirely. I find that camera movement to be another, albeit smaller, barrier between you and the car that interferes with the driving feel. That brings me to the other reason that I like to drive from the cockpit camera. It's more immersive, and I think it really raises the intensity level and therefore the fun of the driving. I think the chase cam can feel just a bit too calm and easygoing. It just doesn't convey the sensation of being in the thick of it that sitting in the cockpit does. I think a big part of this goes back to the visual feedback of the car's behaviour, as I outlined earlier. You actually feel like you're being thrown around rather than watching a car get thrown around. But also, the way everything sounds from the cockpit plays a role too. The transmission whine and the gravel and stones kicking up against the underside of the car really adds an extra little something. A je ne sais brape, if you will. I also think it's very cool to be able to take in the interior detail, which is a major part of the car's character and aesthetic. And of course, having water or dirt on the windscreen affecting your visibility is a whole other immersive element for you to contend with as well. One thing I will acknowledge is that the chase cam tends to be a lot more picturesque and allows you to take in the environmental detail and those glorious exhaust notes. But to that, I say, that's what the replay is for. If anything, you can better take in all those details during the replay because you can allow your eyes to wander instead of having to concentrate on the road. So, with all of this in mind, I think it's important to remember that unless you're some kind of sentient sweat dispenser, sim racing should, first and foremost, be fun. The last thing you should do is let an elitist bully you into playing a way that you don't like. However, I also believe that sometimes in order to discover and acquire the taste of something good, you need to step outside of your comfort zone. So if you're a chase cam driver who hasn't really tried driving from the cockpit, if you take anything away from this video, I want it to be my sincere encouragement for you to give it a go. Try sticking with it for a few sessions and see if it grows on you. You might be pleasantly surprised. But if it doesn't, don't let anybody make you feel bad about it. It's your hobby and your free time. Now, if you're a beginner and you're playing on a controller, you might be thinking to yourself that this is all advanced techniques for people on wheel setups and that it won't make a difference for you. Well, get ready for this hot take, but I actually believe that the cockpit camera is more essential if you're driving with a controller. Compared to a wheel, a controller is a pretty numb experience where you're receiving little to no useful feedback, so you absolutely need to be visually dialed in to feel what the car is doing. I was driving with a controller when I switched the cockpit camera and it made a big difference for me. And as a final pointer, if you find yourself struggling with the cockpit camera, it might also be worth trying out the bonnet camera as a compromise. It's still a first-person view that is locked to the vehicle, so it will have most of the same benefits, but you might find it a little bit easier to see where you're going. There's also the bumper camera, but I'd recommend against them in most cases, as they tend to sit too low, which I find to be poor for visibility. Well, that's all folks. I hope this helps some of you out, but I'd really like to hear people's thoughts on what camera you prefer and why. And if you've made the switch from one to the other, what was the experience like? Let me know in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more sim racing content. Until next time, get a new perspective.